This is going to be lecture number 4, part 2. I'm going to continue talking about the American Revolution and the time period that happened here in the 1776 time period. When we left off, I had mentioned how Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay were sent by Congress in October 1776 to go to Paris to try to sway King Louis XVI to join the American Revolution. It would be a major job on the part of these three men. King Louis had just recently outlawed the Declaration of Independence. He was afraid that his people would get a hold of it in France and then demand the end of the king in France. And so he outlawed it. So these men are against major opposition, trying to get King Louis to join with the Americans and fighting a war against Great Britain. Okay? Now, we also realize if Ben Franklin and John Jay and John Adams can persuade King Louis XVI to join the Revolutionary War, that Spain would join in with them. So we could get the Spanish and the French here together to help us win this war against Great Britain. It'd be a win-win for the American people here and also for the French people to a certain extent. Okay? So John Jay, John Adams, and Ben Franklin leave in October of 1776, sailing across to Europe. Now, I will tell you, Ben Franklin went first. He left earlier than John Adams or John Jay did. Ben Franklin is going to go across the Atlantic Ocean, and on his way over, he's going to play with glass bottles in the ocean to continue his experiments with what is called the Gulf Stream. He's the man who mapped out the Gulf Stream during this time period. And when Ben Franklin arrives in Calais and makes his way into Paris, the French people are in love with him. They celebrate the arrival of Ben Franklin. He is seen as being the savior from lightning, and everybody knows that his work has kept cities from burning to the ground because of the lightning rod. John Adams and John Jay will travel together, but there'll be a companion with them. John Adams decides to bring his young son, John Quincy, to Paris with them. John Quincy Adams, 8 years old, and his mother, Abigail, figured the young boy was better off with his daddy than being home with her in Boston. So John Jay and John Adams and John Quincy Adams are going to go to Paris together. Now, on the way across the Atlantic Ocean to kind of bide time, which is a 6-week trip across the ocean, John Adams and John Jay decided to study French funeral sermons to learn how to speak French. So this is going to be kind of interesting to see these guys going across the Atlantic Ocean, and they're studying French sermons in order to learn how to speak French. Well, Ben Franklin knew a little bit of French. He was not well versed in it, but he figured that he had learned French pretty quickly from his social life. He decided if I intermingle with the people, get to know the people, I will learn my language a whole lot quicker than trying to study some book. It's better to be interactive with the language than trying to be more passive with the language. Okay? When they arrive, John Adams is going to put John Quincy into school here in Paris. The kids that John Quincy go to school with will be the leaders of the French Republic in the early 1800s. So John Quincy is going to go to school here in Paris where he learns the people who become the future leaders of France. He'll know them personally, okay? After spending the some 8 years in Paris, John Quincy and John Adams come back home, and this time John Adams is going to be commissioned to go to London. He'll be the minister to England here starting in 1786 time period. And so they go back. This time John Quincy goes to prep schools with the future leaders of England. He'll know all these individuals. He'll know what they're up to. And his concern is the learning the political background of these people here who are in England. Then he comes back home in 1788 when his father runs for the presidency. And John Quincy is going to enroll at Harvard University. And he becomes well acquainted with the future leaders of America by doing so. And when he turns 23 years old, newly graduated from Harvard, his first job is given to him by George Washington. He becomes a minister to the Dutch. He's going to go to Amsterdam and spend about 6 years here with the Dutch people here as their minister to Holland. And here, as minister to the Dutch, he's going to spend a lot of time in Germany and a lot of time in Russia. And he will be well versed on the people who lead Europe by the time he becomes Secretary of State in 1817, which is pretty important. I don't know a better gentleman who's well qualified to be Secretary of State in this time period than John Quincy Adams. He knows everybody on the French side. He knows everybody on the English side. He knows the people of Holland. He knows the leaders of Germany and the leaders of Russia. And John Quincy Adams, during this time period, is going to write American foreign policy. He is a father of American foreign policy, and we still use the rules of John Quincy Adams today in our foreign affairs. He's a gentleman who in 1823 wrote what was called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was written to explain American foreign affairs. John Quincy wrote it, but President Monroe gave the speech. And so, therefore, it's called the Monroe Doctrine, even though Monroe did not write it. John Quincy wrote it. So you remember a little bit about John Quincy Adams. He's a boy of privilege. He followed his father through a lot of meetings and through a lot of delegations and through a lot of interesting history here. And then he started making history of his own. He also becomes your president in 1824. He'll serve from 1825 to 1829 as your president. So John Quincy is a very important person here in this time period, and he learned on the job. He learned by going to school in Paris and London and at Harvard, and then being minister to the Europeans over here out of Holland here during the time of George Washington. So y'all remember John Quincy, he's a pretty important fellow. Now, when John Jay and John Adams arrived in Paris, they set up an office. They decided their best bet to get in with the King of France was by sending out business cards and sending out letters. So all day long they wrote letters. They went calling on people with their business cards, trying to build a camaraderie with certain individuals trying to get in to see the king. Ben Franklin did not do this. Ben Franklin had no part of their agenda. Ben Franklin says, I am going to all the parties. Every evening at 7 o'clock, I'm going to get myself dressed. By 8 o'clock, I'm in my carriage, and I'm going across Paris to the big salon meetings. These salons took place in people's homes. And the bourgeoisie, the wealthy class, are the ones who had these big parties. And these folks knew the king personally. So Ben Franklin would arrive around 9:30, 10 o'clock in these Parisian homes. They would have cocktails. Then they'd have hors d'oeuvres. Then they have appetizers, and then they had a main course meal. Then about 1 or 1:30 in the morning, here come the dessert carts, and they had dessert. And he didn't get home till like 4 in the morning. And sometimes he didn't go back to his house. He went back to a young lady's house that he met while in the salon. Being like a rock star, he had groupies, and these young girls saw him as a trophy. And so they would invite him back to their house. And Ben Franklin said he learned his French by laying in bed with a beautiful young woman, and by having sweet talk with her, he learned his French. I tell you what, he had a Rosetta Stone going on here, guys, compared to these other two, trying to study French sermons, then are laying in bed with a beautiful young woman, learning French from her. It's quite a different way of learning how to speak French. Well, the funniest thing is that Ben Franklin wouldn't get home until daylight. And he was worn out. His eyes were bloodshot. He was hungover. He'd be in bed by 7 o'clock in the morning, and he wouldn't get till like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he'd come dragging into the office. And it made John Adams so mad because in Poor Richard's Almanac, of which Ben Franklin was the editor, he talked about how a wise man was always up early and ready to work. And he's not obeying his own rules. He lied to the people by telling them to get up early to work when he doesn't do it himself. So Ben Franklin would come in and see what they had done in the office and say, well, I met so-and-so last night, I met so-and-so last night. And he's going to talk to one of the king's aides, and hopefully we can get in with the king that way. So he's trying the party circuit to get to the king, while the other two are trying to do this correspondence type work using writing letters and sending out business cards and all this kind of foolishness. So Ben Franklin will get the attention of the king by his work in the salons, and he went almost every night. He barely missed a night going to the salons. He was well known as being a party boy, and he's 70 years old. That's what's remarkable. He's 70 years old and living a life like a 21-year-old. Okay? Now, Ben Franklin does hear back from the King of England. And King Louis and his court tells the Americans, I will not back you up in a war until you can prove to me that you can win battles. You've got to be able to win battles for me to go and join up with you. Well, George Washington started thinking about how he could really impress the King of France, and he realized by taking a big chunk of the army away from England would go a long ways in impressing the king. Washington realized we do not fight wars after Thanksgiving. You don't fight wars from Thanksgiving until almost Easter time. You have quite a few months off here where you don't fight wars. Well, Washington decided to break the rule. He put together a group of special forces in early December. He got maps of Trenton, New Jersey. Trenton was a big area in which the British are going to house the Hessians, those German mercenaries. And George Washington realized that these men enjoy Christmas time, that Christmas in Germany is a big deal. I want you guys to realize this is the Christmas trees and Santa Claus all came from. The Germans pretty much invented Christmas. All right. And George Washington realized that these men would spend all day Christmas eating and drinking. They'll have their sauerkraut and their sausages and all this stuff, and they'll be drinking all kinds of beer all day, and they'll be celebrating. And on the morning after Christmas, on the 26th, they'll be totally unfit for duty of any kind. They'll probably be hungover for the next 2 days. It might be around the 28th before they're able to even fight a battle after this big, huge celebration on the 24th and on the 25th. So he takes his special forces and they go down to Trenton, New Jersey. And on Christmas Eve, on Christmas night, they're going across the Delaware River. It's snowing, the weather is terrible. Washington realizes that the next morning, if they go in here, they can capture all these men and make them POWs. So crossing the Delaware River was a major, major undertaking by special forces under George Washington. They crossed the river, and early on the 26th of December, they invaded the little villages in which the Hessian soldiers were housed, and the Americans captured them. That's pretty impressive because this is considered being the world's worst fighting force, and you don't mess with Hessians. And here George Washington has captured a whole large number of them. Well, all the boys he took with him on his special forces group were young men who were Germans. In their households, they spoke German. And once they broke in here and got these guys captured, these German-American soldiers began to tell these Hessians about their plans toward democracy. And a lot of Hessians switched sides. A lot of Hessians are going to join the American cause. And a lot of these Hessians who join the American cause will eventually settle down in Pennsylvania. They love Pennsylvania, and you'll see a large German population in Pennsylvania. And once the war has come to an end, these men will get their money together and will send money to their wives and children in Germany and bring them across the Atlantic Ocean. And you see a pretty good-sized German migration take place here in this time period of these women and children coming across the Atlantic to join their husbands here in the late 1780s. And they made it. They settled in here. They built their own businesses. They started their own artisan shops. A lot of these guys became yeoman farmers, and these people made it. They did quite well for themselves. And so democracy goes a long way here, persuading people to change sides. You don't need a king or a pope or anybody else to rule you, but you can have self-rule. So this is very important. This word goes over to France in early 1777. And King Louis has got the impression the Americans might have something going on here that he might want to join up with. Okay, Ben Franklin talked about all this at the salons. John Adams and John J. Rose wrote letters across Paris about what happened here on Christmas, the day after Christmas, in 1776 in Trenton, New Jersey. So you guys remember this is a major, major victory here for the American people when Washington took those Hessians here in this time period. It upset the British pretty much because they couldn't believe this actually happened here. Okay? All right. During the winter of 77, the British authorities, General Howe and his group, have decided that they are going to split the nation in half. They have decided that the colonial Americans' biggest resentment, the biggest group who's causing the problem, are the ones of New England. And they believe if they go up the Hudson River and come down from the Canadian border into Albany on the northern side, come from Washington, come from New York City up the river to Albany, they can cut off the troublemakers, send the army into New England, and stop the war. Remember, guys, the American South is not really in this war yet. A lot of Southerners are still loyal to England. So they're thinking if we can go through and cut New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and all of the Deep South out of this war, then we can go in and reconstruct New England and bring it all back together again and try to find another way to solve the problem with the American people. So Howe has plans to march up the Hudson River to Albany, and he decides to send General Burgoyne to the north here to take the northern parts of New York State and come into Albany area. John Burgoyne is going to take some 8,000 redcoat British soldiers, and they're going to sail up from New York City to the Hudson River, to the St. Lawrence River. On the St. Lawrence River, they'll sail down to about opposite of where Quebec is and make their way into northern New York State. Okay? John Burgoyne is going to hire Iroquois Indians to help him get to the fort system in this old frontier territory. There are two major forts up here that John Burgoyne is interested in. The first fort is called Fort Tongariro. It's an old fort. It's an old French fort. It became an old British fort. The fort is not in great repair, but the fort is useful. And they decided to take Fort Tongariro first, and then march on down and take Saratoga, one of the largest forts, one of the most fortified forts in the region. And so they're going to head down toward Fort Tongariro. All right. They have Indian agents who are going to send them down or help them down on the tour going into the Five Lakes and on down toward Fort Tongariro. George Washington, however, has recruited a group of men who are special forces, and these men are sharpshooters. They're stealth fighters, and their job is to take out the Indian tour guides and to take out the major generals. The British major generals are the soldiers' generals. That's the ones who actually are in charge of the soldiers. You get rid of the soldiers' generals, and then the soldiers have a morale problem. It breaks down their morale. They don't feel safe. They don't feel confident anymore. All right. These special forces are sent up here to northern New York State to stop Burgoyne's army by destroying their tour guides and destroying their major generals. The special forces will have a name, and they're called the Rangers. The Rangers are the ones who come up here, special forces, and they're going to play havoc on Burgoyne's army. They do shoot these guys who are trying to bring them into the region, and they also shoot the major generals. And the army cannot tell where these sharpshooters are shooting from. They're on top of trees, they're on cliffs, they're on mountaintops, they're in valleys, they're along water streams. They're so well hidden, they can't see them. Okay, and that really plays on the morale of these soldiers here in this war. All right. Also, another problem. If you are an officer in the British Navy or the British Army during this time period, you're allowed to bring your wives and kids with you. And behind Burgoyne's army were several hundred women and children. And when they unloaded up here along the St. Lawrence River in the summer of 1777, you had a problem with mosquitoes. And a lot of these women and children came down with yellow fever. You also had wives who were given childbirth during this time period. They were trying to birth children during this time period. So the women and children kind of slowed them down. This is what Washington was planning upon, to give complete havoc here to General Burgoyne. All right. He also sent word to Fort Saratoga, and he told the commanders up here that he wanted to put a small army at Fort Tongariro to make the British believe they'll have an easy victory here in the Hudson River Valley, that they have an easy victory here in this time period. Okay? So they put a skeleton crew up here at Fort Tongariro, but at Saratoga, they shut the door. They slammed it shut. They did the same thing at Saratoga that the French had done over at Old Fort Duquesne, which became Fort Pitt. They had Indian allies. They had lots of soldiers in here. The two generals were General Horatio Gates and General Benedict Arnold. The two most capable American generals were put at Saratoga. And when the British came marching off down here, guys, in October of 77 to Saratoga, after easily taking Fort Tongariro, which was the plan, they found a very distressful situation. General Burgoyne is going to have a major loss here at Saratoga. Saratoga becomes the loss that the French were waiting for. They wanted to see America win a major battle, and we did it here at Fort Saratoga. Part of the reason that the British lost Saratoga is that General Gates was going to send an army up from New York up the Hudson River and rendezvous with Burgoyne at Saratoga. Well, halfway in the mission, Howe changed his mind. General Howe changed his mind and didn't send his troops up here to Saratoga. General Howe decided to send his troops to Philadelphia and capture the American Congress. And when they got down here in Philadelphia in the early fall of 77, Congress was not there. They fled. They went out toward Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and hid out there. Some of these guys went to Northern Virginia and hid out. Some of these guys just went home. And there's nobody to capture here. And General Howe messed up. General Howe messed up. The plan was to go up the river and meet with Burgoyne up here and win the battle against Horatio Gates and against Benedict Arnold. It did not happen. They did not go up here with Philadelphia. It's a complete failure. They totally failed here. And because of Mr. Howe's, General Howe's failure, England calls him home. They'll send a new general over to the United States to fight the war against the Patriots, and his name is going to be George Clinton, Clinton. And George Clinton comes over to fight the Americans when General Howe is dismissed. He is sent out of here. He's sent home here in this time period. Okay. Well, guys, this battle at Saratoga took place on October the 17th, 1777. Word goes down to Philadelphia of the great victory here. Letters are written to Ben Franklin and John Jay and John Adams to explain what took place at Saratoga. At the salons, Ben Franklin told them what he had discovered, what he got word from. The word didn't come in until December. And he's very excited because he had lots of parties to attend during Christmas time in Paris. So by the first of the year, the King of England, Louis XVI, was well aware of Saratoga. He was well aware the Americans had won a major battle here at Saratoga. Okay? And they start talking about joining the American cause. Okay? On the 6th day of February the 6th, 1778, we're going to have a treaty of alliance with the French. Ben Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams will sign the treaty with King Louis XVI. And the French have decided to join the American cause. At the same time, the British are going to send a peace envoy to Paris trying to talk them out of it. And of course, that does not work out too well. France has already decided to side with the Americans. When the French signed on, so did the Spanish. And so now we have two navies together are as large as the British Navy. We've also got Army allies with brand new muskets and brand new artillery. We got people who have deep pockets. They're coming to see us. Okay? Now I want to tell you, when all this took place, the Marquis de Lafayette was in Paris. Remember, he's the first cousin of Marie Antoinette. And I'm sure he played a big role behind the scenes talking to the king because he had privilege that nobody else had. And he'd been over here for over 4 years, almost 5 years, fighting in this war. So Lafayette played a major role in all this stuff. And he persuaded the king. He told him the background information. He told him what he wanted to know and about George Washington, about the American army and so forth, so the king can make a good decision. Okay? One of your biggest generals in France was named Rochambeau. And Rochambeau was put in charge to go to America with a French army. Now, they won't arrive until late 1778. They won't be arriving anytime soon. They got to get the army together, get it prepared, and by the fall of 78, they start heading to the United States. They'll come into Rhode Island. And for a short period of time, they'll be in limbo because the French have blockaded them. But once they get rid of the British threat through sea battles and through land battles, they'll be able to join up regularly with George Washington, which is pretty important that they did here. Rochambeau is going to have George Washington discipline his troops, get his troops into order, make sure his troops are uniformed, make sure those seamstresses are making those uniforms that George Washington has designed for his soldiers to wear. So you're going to see all this take place. All this background stuff takes place when the French shows up. Admiral de Grasse of the French Navy is going to sail his ships down into the Caribbean. So he'll be handy when he's needed. You can get word into the Caribbean as quickly as 3 weeks and be in there by 3 weeks. If you keep the troops over or the Navy over in France, it's going to be 6 weeks getting over and 6 weeks getting back. It'll be 12 weeks. You cut your time in half by having your Navy down the Caribbean. Also, your Spanish Navy is in the Caribbean. They're down in Cuba. They're down in Puerto Rico and those areas. The French Navy is down in Haiti and the Dominican Republic areas. Okay? Which means another important thing here. With the Spanish Navy and the French Navy in the Caribbean, they keep the British from entering from the west through Mississippi River system and having a western front into the Americas. Okay, it keeps the British out of the western territories to attack the Americans from the west. Remember, that's what the French had planned when they had the 7 Years' War, to attack from the west. England knew this was possible. Okay, they also knew the Indians were aligned with them because of Jeffrey Amherst treaty, the Royal Proclamation line, that the Indians were ready to join with the British if they got to the west. So the French and Spanish had a big time out here to make sure the British Navy never entered into the Gulf Coast, and they never did. Pensacola, Mobile, New Orleans were all fortified by the Navy, by the Spanish Navy, and they did not get in here. Okay, they could not come in here. And remember, even though Florida was British during this time period, they kept it all blocked off. They could not infiltrate on the western side. If the British had gotten into Mississippi River system and brought in a lot of their soldiers and came westward, out of the west toward the east, it would not have been a fighting chance. And by having the French and Spanish allies kept them from this maneuvering from this region. Okay? So it's important that you realize this is going on here. in this time period. Okay, so the Grand Alliance was signed on the 6th day of February, 1787. On March the 16th, 1787, the British Peace Commission is going to go to Paris trying to stop France from entering this war. Okay, on May the 8th, 1778, General Clinton shows up and General Howe goes back home. Okay, now in October of 78 and early 79, the British forces are going to make a new attempt toward the American South. They're going in and taking the city of Savannah and the city of Charleston. And when they do all this, they're going to realize that England could have a stronghold back in the South again and could keep the South intact with them, and the war would never come to the South. The South could be the major contributor in which the Americans could lose half of the country. They want to keep the South in the nation here. But a lot of these Southerners have aligned themselves with the English because England is a pay person. They're the ones who writes the checks here for the Southerners here. On the 13th of May, 78, they took the city of Charleston. This is the British. They brought in a general to oversee the South, and his name is going to be Charles Cornwallis. General George Cornwallis is going to come to Savannah. He becomes a British general in charge of the American South to make sure the South does not change sides again. They believe that the South is now back in their hands, and they shall forever keep it here. All right? This scared Washington. Being a Southerner and being an owner of tobacco and other crops that he sold to England, he realized he got to find a way to break the ties between the Americans and the British, the Southerners and the British. So he calls in a very capable general, one of his best friends, whose name is Nathaniel Greene. Remember that Nathaniel Greene, his wife Catherine, are big buddies, are big friends of Washington's. And George Washington tells Nathaniel Greene, I want you to go down there and play havoc against the British. I want you to make old Cornwallis and his people like Thornton, General Thornton, so mad that they will go on a chase with you across the South. I don't want you to lose battles, and I don't want you to win battles. What I want you to do is take the fight to the Southern people. Let them see how the British treats them in battle. And the American people, the Southern people, will change sides when they see the attitude of the British and how they're going to treat them. So Nathaniel Greene is going to come south. He's got several thousand men, about 6,000 men in his army. He comes into South Carolina, into Georgia. And he starts really aggravating the British. And he starts a fox race. The fox race is going to go from Savannah out to Columbia. From Augusta into Columbia. It's going to go from Charleston into Columbia. And from Columbia, they head on up toward where Anderson and Greenville is today, Greenwood, South Carolina. They head up toward Spartanburg. If you guys travel Interstate 85 from Atlanta to Charlotte, North Carolina, you'll go by a lot of these battlefields. Actually, if you go as far as Greensboro, you'll see these battlefields. Cowpens, Kings Mountain, the battle at Gastonia, the battle at Guilford Courthouse. These are along Interstate 85 today. When you go up there, you'll see all these different battlefields marked on the interstate. You can turn off and go to the actual battlefields. When I lived in Charlotte, I spent a whole afternoon over in Kings Mountain. Just wanted to see what all took place at Kings Mountain here in this time period. And they carry this war across South Carolina into North Carolina. And what they did was they came from the Gulf Coast of the Carolinas, even as far north as Florence, and made their way across the entire state up to Camden and so forth, and made their way to Greenville, Spartanburg, and then they turned north towards Charlotte and carried the war on up into North Carolina, out toward Raleigh. And it ended up over in Wilmington when the British forces retreated, when they left. So they created this big sea across North and South Carolina in this big battle. Okay? And of course, the rule was don't win battles and don't lose battles, to keep the British moving. And what they did was, guys, as they came through these little towns, they burned the little towns down. The British did. They burned down people's houses. They freed their slaves and put them in the British Army. They went through and they destroyed their crops. They stole from their barns and from their smokehouses. They stole their silverware. Anything of value, they took it. And the people of South Carolina, the people of North Carolina will soon join the Patriot cause. Nathaniel Greene did his job as required by President Washington. It was all done according to plan. You know, they got to Guilford Courthouse. They all got tangled up here in a big battle. You couldn't tell British soldiers from American soldiers. They're on top of each other. It's a face-to-face, hand-to-hand combat going on up here. And Cornwallis realized he had to go through and break up this fight. So he took his cannons and he lined them on one side of the battlefield, and he filled them full of grape shot. This is like ball bearings. You can put 200 grape shot in one cannon. And he filled about 10 cannons full of grape shot, and he put the gunpowder in there, and he fired into the crowd of soldiers. He killed as many of his men as he did of Patriots in this battle out here, but he broke up the battle. And once the failure had been realized here at Guilford Courthouse, they're going to march to Wilmington, North Carolina. This is the British. And here they board British ships and they sailed back into Long Island. He retreated. He retreated from this forces here. Okay? Now, in the meantime, while all this is going on in South Carolina, a young kid out of Waxhaw, whose name was Hugh Jackson, he's 18 years of age. His father had just recently passed away. And he has a mother and two brothers. And he decided the best thing for him to do is go join the American cause. He saw how bad the British were here at Kings Mountain. He decided to go join the American Patriot cause. He got up here, and 2 weeks later, after arriving, he died from heat stroke. He got too hot and he died. When word comes home that Hugh has died, his two younger brothers, Robert and Andrew, decide to ride up into North Carolina and to find Nathaniel Greene and join his army to replace their fallen brother. Well, these teenage boys love to play hide and seek. And Nathaniel Greene knew this, and he had several dozen high school boys, middle school boys who had come and joined his army. And he told these boys, I want you guys to go down and visit the British troops at night. I want y'all to sneak around behind barrels and wooden boxes and artillery and behind tents, and y'all listen to what's going on here with the British soldiers and the British generals. I want you to spy, to listen, to see what their plans are. I want you to stay down there till about 3 o'clock in the morning. At about 3 o'clock, I want you guys to start kicking around buckets and pans and shooting off firecrackers and waking up these Brits. And then y'all run out of there as quick as you can so you don't get captured. The whole idea was to make sure that the British did not ever receive a good night's sleep, that they'd always be tired because they were woken up in the middle part of the night and could not go back to sleep. Well, about 3 weeks being with the Americans, Andrew and Robert go off down here one evening, and they get captured. The old British general who's talking to these boys, trying to get information from these boys, get mad at Andrew. He wants Andrew to polish his boots, and Andrew won't do it. And the soldier gets mad at Andrew and takes his bayonet off his gun, and he cuts Jackson's face on both sides. That's why he has those deep creases in his cheek. Then they took these two boys and threw them into a POW camp. And in this POW camp, both Andrew and Robert received smallpox. Several weeks later, not hearing from her boys, Mrs. Jackson rides up to Nathaniel Greene's army to see where her boys are. And he tells her, we have not seen them for several weeks. The British have captured them. Well, she rides off down to the British, and she's mad. And after she scolds and gets on to these soldiers, these British officers here, they'll tell her, your two boys are in that holding pen over there. They both got smallpox. Take them home, get them out of here. Robert is so sick that she puts Robert on horseback and she leads him home. Andrew is slumped over toward the back of the horse, making it step by step all the way home. It might have saved his life by walking. Robert got home and he died. So she lost two of her boys, Robert and Hugh, because of the British. Okay? Mrs. Jackson is also the one who taught her sons how to hate Native Americans. She was there on the frontier when Nederland's armies attacked back in 1764 time period. She was a young lady during this time period, a young girl, and she was scared of Indians. And she taught this hatred, this racism to her sons. And Andrew is not really enthused about Native Americans. He questions if they're even human. Okay? Andrew recovers, starts doing a whole lot better, started getting around, doing his own thing. And Mama Jackson decided that her best choice was to go and help the Americans down in Charleston. In Charleston was a large number of wounded American soldiers, and she went down to nurse in Charleston. And while in Charleston, she died from cholera. She died. Andrew is left all alone. And Andrew says, one day, I will get my revenge for my family against the British. That day will come on the 8th day of January, 1815, at a place called New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans is where Andrew Jackson gets his revenge against the British. Andrew Jackson has got some major issues, and a lot of them deals with that he's really hot-tempered. He does his thing, and nobody else's reasoning will get to him. He will do what he wants to, regardless of what everybody else tells him he should be doing. He's headstrong and he's stubborn. He's going to do a lot of atrocities that should not have been done by an American president, including lots of murdering. He's got lots of blood on his hands when he becomes the president of the United States. Okay? And Andrew, if he's around today, would be heavily medicated. I don't think he might not even be in society. They probably have him institutionalized because of the way he was and the way he conducted himself in this time period. He's going to leave Waxhaw and eventually move to Nashville, Tennessee. And between going from Waxhaw to Nashville, those 5 or 6 years, he's going to become an educated man. He's going to teach school, and he's going to pass the bar exam. He's going to read the law with a lawyer and then pass the bar exam. So he goes to Nashville, Tennessee as a lawyer, okay? And becomes a successful lawyer in Tennessee, okay? He'll eventually be part of the Tennessee State Supreme Court. So Jackson is going to make his way to Nashville, Tennessee, where all the strife and all the horrors of North Carolina and South Carolina are put behind him, and he gets a new start. Okay, he'll also build a big racetrack out here and build a nice big home for his wife, who he'll marry in the early 1790s. Her name was Rachel Robards, and he marries Rachel, and he's madly in love with Rachel. And Rachel becomes his medicine. She knows how to take care of him when his mental condition begins to lax. So you guys remember all of this stuff. Rachel becomes, by the way, when he married Rachel, she thought she was divorced from Robards, and it turned out the judge had delayed signing the papers, and they got married illegally. They had to go and separate for about 6 months and then go back and remarry. And this becomes a major political issue when he runs for the presidency, about him and Rachel and their relationship during this time period. Okay, so you guys remember what's going on here between Rachel and Jackson in this period of time. But Jackson got restarted over in Nashville, Tennessee. And with his hermitage and his racetrack, he becomes a very wealthy man. He's also an owner of a large plantation, and he's got over 100 people enslaved on his plantation. So Jackson is a very interesting character with his racism and with his white supremacy and with his mental state from time to time. He's an interesting person to look at, okay? So you guys don't forget about Andrew Jackson and his up and coming toward his career. On March the 15th, 1781, Charles Cornwallis and his army retreats to Wilmington, North Carolina. They go back to Long Island, New York, okay? On June the 11th, 1781, Congress appoints a peace commission to negotiate with Great Britain for peace. And in this are going to be John Adams, John Jay, and Ben Franklin. They're already over there. And to represent Congress, they're going to send over a gentleman whose name is Henry Lawrence, Laurens. Henry Lawrence is going to be with the United States envoy on this peace treaty. The British will send Richard Oswald to negotiate the peace on the British side. So here, guys, as early as June of 1781, England is calling for a peace commission. They're going to go to Paris for this peace commission. Now, what in the world is going on? Why has England all of a sudden decided on a peace commission here in 1781? It's very simple. The people of England are tired of this war. The people of England are tired of this war. Civilians will tolerate war for about 18 months. After 18 months, war becomes troublesome for the people. And the people of England started protesting this war in 1780. They marched the streets. They did peaceful protests. Some peaceful protests is going to turn into riots. And people come in, overturn wagons, set wagons on fire. They're going to go through and loot buildings and break into businesses and loot them and burn buildings here. Peaceful protests will have a fringe area that involves riots. And that has not changed one bit. Some people take opportunity of peaceful protest in order to riot and loot and steal and gain items that they want for their households. It has not changed whatsoever. On your college campuses, the college kids started protesting this war. They had sit-down strikes. They had all kinds of problems here. The kids are going to loot the buildings. Some of these kids are going to overturn professors' wagons and carriages out here. There'll be fire set. The people of England are tired of this war, and they're hollering, "Bring our redcoat boys home. Bring our Navy home. Why are you killing our cousins? Give the Americans what they want, because you know it's not going to work. And when it falls apart, we'll just go back over and pick up the pieces and start the colony all over again." That's the attitude in England. They're tired of this war here in this time period. King George III is facing some major opposition here in this time period. His parliament is being threatened for overturn. When the people get tired and their voices are raised and their votes are cast, major change takes place. Major change takes place. Well, guys, Britain decided to have another major attack. It's because of Roosevelt and George Washington. Oh, these two guys got real smart. And I mean, what they planned here is brilliant. They decided to make the British believe that the Americans and the French were going to attack them across the Hudson River. That the American and French armies would all gather together over in New Jersey and do an assault across Hudson's River into Manhattan. It's a trap. It's a beautifully planned trap. What they did was Rochambeau George Washington put several thousand men across the river in New Jersey. And here in New Jersey, they're going to put up all these tents. It's going to be a tent city. And these men will go around all during the daytime and set up lumber or set up logs in big, huge fire pits. And at night, they'll light these logs, and the British believe the Americans are across the river. And it's a big, huge, it's like a 4-mile long city back here, 6-mile long city back here. They put wind catchers on the tents so you see movement from the sunlight hitting those sun catchers. And they put bells out there, and they had men who played reveille and all this kind of stuff. And it sounds like a very active camp over here across the river. In the meantime, Rochambeau and George Washington took the main army down to the Yorktown Peninsula, down to Jamestown and Williamsburg. Okay? Over in New York City, the British believed that they could send troops down to Yorktown Peninsula and come in behind the Americans and the French armies in New Jersey and totally close the book up on them, totally shut them out. They had no idea where the Americans and the French were actually located. So they took Rochambeau and a large army, and they transported them down to Yorktown Peninsula. They got down here in August of 1781 time period. They started unloading those boats down here, ready to attack, or make their way, I should say, up the Yorktown Peninsula, up toward New Jersey, and come in behind the Americans and the French and shut the book up on them. They had no idea the Americans were waiting for them. The Americans had also sent word, or the French had sent word down to the Caribbean for Admiral de Grasse to come up. And he arrived here, guys. In late August of 1781. Now, here's your dates on all this stuff. On August the 11th, 1781, Cornwallis's army lands at Yorktown Peninsula. Okay? They started unloading all those boats with all those supplies to make war against the Americans up here in New Jersey. On August the 14th, as the British ships were trying to leave the James River, the Yorktown Peninsula, and trying to Chesapeake Bay region, General de Grasse shows up. It's August 14th. De Grasse has got 29 French warships here, and they attacked the British Navy on the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis is trapped, and all those boats are also taken away from the British. Admiral de Grasse showed up at the right moment to blockade the British Navy from leaving the Chesapeake. And now Cornwallis has his back to the bay, and the Americans and the French on the land before him. And he has no real place to wiggle. And during September, the Americans and the French will use their large sea guns, their large siege guns against the British. On October 17th, 1781, General Cornwallis surrenders. October 17th, 1781, General Cornwallis surrenders. Okay? The British people now say, bring our boys home. There's no way you can win this war, bring our boys home. On March the 3rd, 1782, because that's all the news got to England and so forth, they're 6 weeks over, the British Parliament empowers King George to negotiate peace with the new United States of America. On March the 5th, 1782, the United States is recognized as a leading world, or as a leading power. The United States is recognized as a newly developed country, and King George is the one who recognized it through the word of Parliament. Okay? The European attitude is that King George had made a bad mistake The Americans are going to eventually fail, and we'll all come back and pick up the pieces of where the Americans fell apart. March the 15th, 1783. Remember, this is all during the negotiation time period. It takes a while to get these negotiations going between these different countries in this war. And by the way, the Revolutionary War was a world war. It took place across around the world, even the Philippines. It saw war here, guys. Okay, on March the 15th, 1783, George Washington has got a major problem. His soldiers and his officers have not been paid. And they're all concerned they fought this war and they would not be reimbursed for it. Now, Congress will find ways to pay these guys back. And sometimes they got paid in land. They received land for their war services. All right. Washington realizes that these soldiers are planning a coup attempt, that these officers are planning to go to Philadelphia and overthrow the Congress and take over. And he realizes if they do this, that the revolution was all done in vain. So he calls these officers together in Connecticut at a place that's called the Castle. It's a large log cabin. It's called the Castle. And he called in his officers. And they all sat around out there in chairs. They lined the walls. Some were squatting up toward the front. Some were sitting cross-legged up front. And here comes in the general. Washington gets behind the podium. Remember, Washington's about 6'3", a very impressive person. He starts talking to, he starts trying to level with them. I want to tell you, Washington was short-tempered. He didn't like putting with a lot of mess. And he let them know real quickly how he thought about all this stuff. And he tried to reason with them, and they would not be reasoned with. In the last attempt, he said, if you men will pardon me, I have a letter here from a congressional member, and I want to read it to you. It explains to you the trouble they're having in Philadelphia and how the nation does not have a whole lot of money at this time. Well, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the letter, pulled out the envelope, set the envelope on the podium, started decreasing the letter, trying to get the creases out of it. He started reading it, but he couldn't read it. He could not see the words to read it. He says, if you men will pardon me, I have not only gone gray for my country, I've also gone blind. I'm going to put my spectacles here and I'm going to read this letter to you. So he reached in his pocket, pulled out his glasses, put them on, read the letter, folded the letter up, put it in the envelope, and walked out of the building. When he told them his personal cost of this war, they realized they were all in it together. They should not go and try a coup attempt. So, guys, George Washington is going to save the Revolutionary War here in Connecticut with these officers. They realized they all had paid a price, and Washington had almost gone blind and gray because of this war. They never again talked of a coup attempt. Ours is the only revolution that did not involve a coup attempt. Revolutions fail because the people take over the revolution and they destroy it, particularly the armies, okay? So Washington here on March the 15th, 1783 is going to save the revolution. During the summer of 73, I'm sorry, the summer of 1783, the loyalists who had not signed loyalty oaths are expelled from the country. 80,000 people were removed. 80,000 loyalist men, I should say, were removed because they did not sign a loyalty oath. My Martin Weatherford, my sixth great-grandfather in Georgia, he's an Indian agent. He had a big, huge trading house there in Augusta. He had a big trading house there in Augusta. The man had lots of money, and he was deported because he didn't sign a loyalty oath. He didn't sign a loyalty oath, and he's deported. His son, his older children, including Charles, signed a loyalty oath. And Charles eventually went to Alabama to live with his wife, Sohoy III. Alexander McGillivray, did not sign a loyalty oath, but he fled and went to the Creek Indian Nation to hide out. And he becomes the leader of the Creek Indians during this time period. All right. John Patton and William Leslie leave Savannah as loyalist merchants with a large fleet of some 25 ships. They sail down the east coast of Florida, make their way through the Straits of Florida into Key West, and come directly to Pensacola, Florida. And in Pensacola, Patton and Leslie will establish a large trading house that will trade between New Orleans and Mobile and Pensacola and St. Mark's and Tampa eventually, and on into Havana, Cuba, and into the Bahamas. They become extremely successful. The University of West Florida has a Patton and Leslie records, and I was privileged to them. I went down there and talked to Dean DeBoat, who's in charge of the archives, and told Dean when I was looking for it, I said, David, I got this stuff right here for you. Come read it. He brought me the big books out. He brought me the Loyalist records where the Loyalists had been paid off. I found Martin Weatherford being paid off. I found Lester McGilvery being paid off. I read all that history. I read about Patton and Leslie and how they traveled and how the Weatherfords traveled in the Caribbean on their ships. They were based in the Bahamas, the Weatherfords were. And it's just some remarkable stories that I found here that I would not have gotten if I did not know those books existed at the University of West Florida, and they've been translated into English from the Spanish. Professor Coker out there had done all that work back in the 1970s and 1980s and written several books that dealt with the history of Pensacola. So then you guys see Mr. Coker's book, y'all look at it. It's something interesting to read about in our local history. Okay? All right. So these loyalists were deported. By the way, they also deported slaves of the families. Martin Weatherford had 25 people who were enslaved. He brought his family into Spanish Florida. They settled along the St. Johns River just north of Palatka. It's just below Jacksonville. When the Spanish retook Florida, they forced the British out of here. And so Martin made his way down to Nassau, Bahamas, and he worked for Patton and Leslie. He's one of their agents down here in the Bahamas. They've all been big buddies in Georgia, and they just kind of re-established themselves in a new territory. And Martin took his people down here, including his slaves, and he freed his slaves because you cannot grow cotton in the Bahamas. You cannot grow tobacco in the Bahamas. The only real industry in the Bahamas during this time period was sponge divers. And I found several of his sons being involved in sponge diving in this time period. You know, it makes us wonder how come us Weatherfords love the beach so much. And we love the Gulf. We all like to go surfing and all this kind of stuff. That's why. It's in the family DNA. All right, it's part of our heritage here to have this. And y'all find the same things in your family when you go through and do your family research. Interesting thing to say, interesting things to look at. I want you guys to realize something. Over 800,000 white Americans, I'm not going to include the slaves here, white Americans were exported because their old men were loyalists. 80,000 men took 800,000 people, white people with them. I bet you go through and you count the African Americans who went out of this group, you're going to have close to 500,000 people just in that group alone. So a large number of people were deported from the country during this time period. Oh, by the way, those loyalists in Georgia like McGilvery and Weatherford, their plantations were given to officers in the American Army. Nathaniel Greene receives a 1,000-acre plantation that a loyalist had owned northwest of Savannah. On Savannah River, about 3 miles up the river, Nathaniel Greene received a plantation. It had once been a loyalist plantation. McGilvery's plantations and Weatherford's plantations were all given to Army officers who had been part of the Southern Frontier War. Okay, so it's interesting you look at all this and understand this history. Now, guys, a lot of these men lived in New York and Philadelphia and Boston because they were merchants. They had merchant fleets and so forth. Those men didn't get a chance to go to the Bahamas. These men went to Canada. A lot of your loyalists and their slaves are going to go to the St. Lawrence River. Now, they're going to move in on the south side of the river. This up here, this is no man's territory between Massachusetts and the St. Lawrence, between New York and the St. Lawrence. This will eventually become parts of New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine eventually. But a lot of these loyalist families settled up here along the St. Lawrence River. If you take 500,000 people, which is probably more than that, went up that area, because the Bahamas couldn't hold a whole lot. If you take 800,000 people that went up to the St. Lawrence River and settled in 1783, how many people are there in 1814, in 1815? You've got over 2 million people up here. And these 2 million people do not like America because they were thrown out of the country. And they believe they were done badly by the people here in this time period. So the United States decides to invade Canada during the War of 1812. Guess who stops them? And they're never, ever allowed to take Canada. One of the major goals of the United States was eventually to capture Canada and make it part of the country. And these loyalist children stopped it. So in the long run, they made a big mistake. They should have left the loyalists alone here in North America. They should have let them sign a loyalty oath, even though the time had expired. They should have let them sign the loyalty oath and stayed here. And probably our history would be a little bit different than what it is today. Okay? All right. During the same time period, England took those southern slaves that joined the British Army, and they freed them. They transported these folks into Canada and also to Bermuda to live. So guys, you have these folks being freed from slavery, and they were transported to Bahamas, to Bermuda, and also to Canada. A few did go to the Bahamas, not a large number. Okay. Now here's what's interesting. What if England had won the war? They might have freed all the slaves. Thought about that? That's a major discussion in this time period. What do you do about slavery? Because in slavery, you need a big crop in order to grow, in order to have slaves. Well, tobacco had been mechanicalized to a certain degree that slavery was not really needed for tobacco, or for rice, or for sugarcane. Cotton was too labor intensive to be considered a crop for slavery. Okay? They don't see cotton as being important at all towards slavery. And of course, this will change in 1793 when Eli Whitney shows up at the Nathaniel Green Plantation in Savannah, Georgia. And it's going to change the whole scheme of things here in this time period. All right. The peace treaty is going to be signed on the 3rd of September, 1783. The final treaty is signed the 3rd of September, 1783. The Continental Congress will not ratify the treaty until early 1784. Remember the distance, the travel time between Paris and Philadelphia. Okay, so the treaty was signed on the 3rd of September, 1783. Okay, it won't be until early 1784 that the treaty is finally signed by both the Americans and by the British. Okay, in the peace treaty. Spain had some real issues here, particularly with Florida, and they decided to switch some land around with Great Britain in order to get Florida back. So the United States would be north of Spanish Florida. And so Spain regained Florida in this peace treaty. England remained in Canada. That did not change. The British remained in Canada. The United States went from Spanish Florida, which the borderline was about where Troy is today and Demopolis is today. That's your border here in this time period. That border will change in the early 1800s, but right now it's going to be toward the southern part of Alabama. Is where the border of Spanish Florida. It ran up there above Natchez. Okay? And then from there northward to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River would be the United States. The United States would go from Spanish Florida to the Great Lakes and up to the St. Lawrence River. The United States would go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River system. Mississippi River system was seen as being the most western part of the country. We had no desires for anything across the river. A lot of folks said that land across the river was full of volcanoes and earthquakes and witches and poisonous air, poisonous volcanoes. The main concern was witches. And in The Wizard of Oz, you had that wicked witch of the West. And she is well and alive in this time period. What do you do about that wicked witch of the West? How do you get rid of her? Okay, and that's one of the main concerns here in this time period. Okay, on the 25th day of November, 1785, I'm sorry, 1784. I'm sure I have the right dates here, David. 1783 is November the 25th, 1783. The British finally leave New York City. And once they leave New York City, George Washington is going to go down to have a big meeting with his officers. They're going to meet downtown in New York, one of the larger restaurants, and they all eat. They have a little time of talking, a little bit of celebration going on down here. Washington will leave there, it's the 25th day of November. He will leave there and go to Philadelphia. He arrives in Philadelphia around the middle part of December. And here on the 23rd of December, 1783, George Washington resigns from the United States Army. King George could not believe a man of this power would quit his job. But George Washington did for several reasons. Number one, he wanted to go home. He was tired. He was older. He was tired. He had a lot of body aches, a lot of issues to deal with, like his wooden teeth. And this man decided to resign, to leave the army. He also said, by me leaving the army will show me that army officers do not become the leaders of the country. That the army officers will not lead the country. That we'll be civilians when we run for office and not army people. Separation of the army from the political. Okay? Separation of the army from the political. So George Washington is very smart here in this time period. He says, I will not be a commander-in-chief. I'll be the president. Okay, I will not be a military commander-in-chief. I'll be the president. I'll be the one who'll have the American people. I'm the one who'll take care of their safety, guard them, and take care of them. Okay, and try to do the best I can to keep the nation from war. Okay, so he resigns from the army during this time period. So George Washington makes the precedent that if you're going to run for political office, you should not be a military person. You should be retired from the military before you run for office. Okay, on the 25th day of December, he's home from the war. He's home from the war, and he considers the war to be completely over. Okay, so George Washington is a very interesting character to look at in this time period. And you can truly say he is the father of our country because he actually kept a coup attempt from happening, which could have destroyed the country. He's going to lead us through war. He's going to show us that even though he is not well educated, that he can find the people to work with him to help him become a better person. And that's why he brought in Lafayette and Knox and Greene and so forth. It's very important in this time period. So he's showing us, guys, a blueprint, a way to run our country in a very democratic way in which not one person seeks the power and seeks to try to find a way to become a dictator over the country. Remember, guys, they have a very good reason for doing all this stuff because they had read about Oliver Cromwell in England here after the British Civil War. And Washington was also concerned about a civil war breaking out between the states. So he's trying to find various ways here, guys, to lead the American people, to show them they're people above their European inheritance. They're above war. Okay? And that concludes the lecture number 4 for this class. And I will be back shortly with your number 5 lecture. Okay? All right. Thank you, guys. Y'all have a good day, and I will see y'all later.